The dusty mechanic yard in Kumasi fell silent when Abena Owusu was pushed toward the gate, her torn dress smeared with grease and her voice shaking as she begged for one more day to pay her repair bill. Her little brother needed medicine, and without her delivery cart, she would have no way to earn it. Laughter rippled through the workers until a quiet mechanic stepped forward. Without a word, he dropped a thick bundle of cash onto the workbench. The owner froze. Across the street, a woman beside a black luxury SUV watched with fury. Because the man Abena just thanked through tears was Felix Kankam, heir to a billion-dollar empire, pretending to be poor. Before the story begins, tell me something. Where are you watching from, and what time is it in your country right now? And if stories about courage, love, and unexpected justice move, you consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Several months before the moment that silenced the mechanic yard life for Abena Owusu was a quiet struggle, fought one day at a time. The small room she rented stood at the edge of a crowded neighborhood in Kumasi, where tin roofs rattled whenever the wind blew, and narrow alleys filled with the smell of charcoal smoke and fried plantains every evening. The building itself was old, its cracked walls painted a faded yellow that had long ago surrendered to dust and rain. Inside that single room lived Abena and her younger brother, Kwame. Kwame was only 9 years old, thin and quiet, in a way that worried Abena more than any complaint ever could. His breathing sometimes came in shallow bursts, especially at night when the air grew heavy. The doctor at the small government clinic had explained that Kwame's lungs were weak after a childhood infection that had never been properly treated. Medicine helped, but medicine cost money. And money was something Abena rarely had. Their parents had died in a road accident 5 years earlier while traveling between villages to sell cassava. Since that day, Abena had been both sister and mother to Kwame. At 19, she had already learned more about responsibility than many people twice her age. Every morning before sunrise, Abena tied a faded scarf around her hair, pushed open the wooden door of their room, and stepped into the narrow street with determination. Her most valuable possession was a rusty delivery cart. The cart was simple, 2 wheels, a wooden platform, and a long metal handle. It allowed her to carry goods for market vendors, sacks of rice, baskets of oranges, crates of bottled drinks, anything that needed moving from the trucks to stalls. For each trip, she earned a few cedis. Some days she made enough to buy food. On good days, she could also buy Kwame's medicine. On bad days, she returned home with nothing but tired muscles and dust in her lungs. Still, Abena never allowed herself to collapse under the weight of it all, because every evening when she returned home, Kwame would sit near the door waiting, and when he saw her, his eyes always lit up. That alone was enough reason to keep going. One afternoon, under the unforgiving Kumasi sun, Abena was pushing the cart through the market when disaster struck. The right wheel suddenly twisted with a loud crack. The cart lurched violently to one side. Abena barely managed to stop the load of bottled drinks from crashing onto the ground. She stared down at the broken wheel. The metal axle had bent inward. Without repair, the cart was useless. And without the cart, she had no way to work. A tight knot formed in her chest. She could already imagine the landlord knocking on the door asking for rent she didn't have. She could already see Kwame coughing at night while the medicine bottle sat empty. Abena pushed the cart slowly through the streets until she reached a roadside mechanic yard she had passed many times before. The place was loud and chaotic. Old engines lay scattered across the dirt. Oil stains darkened the ground. The air carried the smell of grease and burning metal. Several mechanics worked under a tin roof, while radios played high-life music in the background. The owner of the yard, a thick-set man named Yaw Dongkor, stood near the entrance wiping his hands on a rag. He glanced at the broken cart. "Wheel axle bent," he said bluntly. "You'll need a new rod." Abena swallowed nervously. "How much will it cost?" Yaw examined the damage again. 200 cedis. The number struck her like a slap. 200. That was more than she earned in an entire week. She lowered her eyes. I don't have that much, she admitted softly. Yaw shrugged. Then I cannot fix it. The other mechanics barely looked up from their work. To them, broken carts and poor customers were everyday sights. Abena stood there, silently trying to think. Behind Yaw, one of the younger mechanics was crouched beside a motorcycle engine. His hands were dark with grease and his work shirt carried several oil stains. Unlike the others, he had not laughed or ignored her. Instead, he had been watching quietly. His name, at least the name everyone in the yard knew him by, was Felix. Felix stood up slowly and walked over. "Let me see," he said. His voice was calm and gentle. Abena stepped aside. Felix knelt beside the cartwheel and examined the damage carefully. He rotated the axle slightly, testing the bend. "It can still be repaired," he said after a moment. Yaw frowned. "Repaired? The rod is bent." Felix shrugged slightly. "If we heat it and straighten it, it might last." Yaw looked doubtful, but uninterested. "Do what you want," he said, "but she still has to pay." Abena felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I will pay," she said quickly. "Maybe not today, but I will." Felix glanced up at her. For the first time, their eyes met properly. There was exhaustion in Abena's gaze, but also something else. Dignity. She wasn't begging for charity. She was asking for time. Felix looked back at the broken wheel. "Come back tomorrow afternoon," he said quietly. Abena blinked in surprise. "You will fix it," Felix nodded. "Yes. How much will it cost, then?" she asked carefully. Felix wiped his hands on a rag. "We will see." Yaw snorted from behind them, but Felix had already picked up a wrench and begun loosening the damaged axle. The next afternoon, Abena returned. She had spent the entire morning worrying that perhaps the mechanic had forgotten her. But when she arrived at the yard, Felix was already standing beside the cart. The wheel had been removed. A new straightened rod lay beside it. Felix tightened the final bolt and spun the wheel. It turned smoothly. "Try pushing it," he said. Abena placed her hands on the handle and pushed. The cart rolled forward perfectly. Her face lit up with relief. "It works," she whispered. Felix nodded. "Yes." She hesitated for a moment. "How much do I owe you?" Felix studied her quietly. Then he said, "You can pay little by little." Abena nodded gratefully. "I will." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Around them, the mechanic yard buzzed with noise again. But something small and important had just begun. Abena pushed the cart toward the street. After a few steps, she stopped and turned back. "Thank you, Felix." He gave a small nod. "You're welcome." She walked away, pushing the cart back toward the busy Kumasi market. Felix watched until she disappeared into the crowd. Behind him, Yardonkor crossed his arms. "You know she may never pay you," he said. Felix looked down at his grease-covered hands. "That is not why I fixed it," he replied quietly. What no one in that mechanic yard knew was that the quiet young man who had just repaired a poor girl's cart was Felix Kankam, the heir to one of the largest transport empires in Ghana. And for the first time since he had begun pretending to live like an ordinary mechanic, he felt something unexpected: curiosity about the girl who refused to beg and the strength hidden behind her tired eyes. From that day forward, Abena Owusu became a familiar face at Yardonkor's mechanic yard. At first, she came only when work brought her nearby. The market stalls where she carried goods were scattered across several streets of Kumasi, and occasionally her delivery cart needed tightening or adjustment after a long day on the rough roads. Each time she arrived, the same sounds greeted her: the clanging of metal, the whir of electric drills, The smell of burning oil rising from engines opened like wounded animals. Ya Donkor usually stood near the entrance, shouting instructions while the younger mechanics moved around him like restless bees. But Abena's eyes always searched for one person: Felix. He was rarely loud like the others, while the mechanics joked or argued over football matches playing on the radio. Felix usually worked quietly in the corner of the yard, focused on whatever machine sat before him. Sometimes it was a motorcycle, sometimes an old car engine, sometimes nothing more complicated than a broken generator. Yet the way he worked always seemed different, precise, patient, as if machines spoke a language only he understood. The first few weeks after repairing her cart, Abena tried her best to repay the money. Every few days she arrived with small folded notes, 5 cedis, sometimes 10. Felix always accepted the money with the same calm nod. He never reminded her, never pressured her, never even mentioned how much remained. One afternoon, as the sun hung low over the city, Abena pushed the cart into the yard again. Her face was dusty from work and sweat darkened the collar of her faded blue dress. Felix was crouched beside an old motorcycle. He looked up when he heard the cart wheels. "You again," he said. Abena smiled slightly. "Yes." She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small bundle of notes. "Another 10 cedis," she said. Felix took the money and slipped it into his shirt pocket. "You don't have to rush," he said. Abena shook her head. "I promised I would pay." Felix studied her for a moment. Then he asked, "How is your brother?" Abena blinked in surprise. "You remember," Felix shrugged. "You mentioned him, Kwame." Even saying his name softened Abena's expression. "He is better this week," she said. "The medicine helped. That is good." For a moment, silence settled between them. Then Ya Donkor shouted from across the yard, "Felix, the taxi engine." Felix sighed quietly and stood. "Work calls," he said. Abena nodded. "Thank you again." As she turned to leave, Felix watched her push the cart down the dusty road toward the market. Something about her presence lingered in his thoughts long after she disappeared. Over time, Abena's visits became more frequent. Sometimes she stopped by just to tighten a bolt on the cart. Sometimes she brought a cracked kettle or a broken stove handle someone in the market wanted repaired. Sometimes she simply passed through the yard on her way home. And slowly, without either of them noticing exactly when it happened, conversation began to grow between them. At first it was small things. How busy was the market today? Did the rain damage the roads? Did Kwame sleep well? But gradually their talks stretched longer. One evening the power in the neighborhood suddenly went out, plunging the entire street into darkness except for the faint orange glow of a nearby food stand. The mechanics closed the yard early. Felix stepped outside and saw Abena still waiting near the gate with her cart. "You're still here?" he asked. She nodded. "I was hoping to ask if the left wheel was loose again." Felix crouched down and inspected it under the dim light. "Just the bolt," he said. "Give me a minute." He tightened it quickly. When he finished, Abena didn't leave immediately. Instead, she sat on the edge of the cart. The city around them felt unusually quiet. "What made you become a mechanic?" she asked. Felix paused. No one in the yard had ever asked him that. He wiped his hands slowly with a rag. "I like understanding how things work," he said. "That sounds simple," Abena said with a small smile. "It is." And before this, Felix hesitated for the briefest moment. Before this, his life had been something completely different. Boardrooms, private jets, luxury apartments in Accra and Lagos. But none of that existed in the story he told people here. "I studied engineering," he said finally. Abena raised her eyebrows. "You studied?" Felix nodded. "So why work here?" Felix leaned back against the fence. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "it is easier to understand life when you are close to ordinary people." Abena laughed softly. If this place is ordinary, then my life must be very ordinary. Felix looked at her. I don't think so. What Abena never knew was that several kilometers away inside a sleek glass office tower in Kumasi, Felix's name carried enormous weight. Felix Kankam, the son of Nana Kankam, founder of Kankam Logistics Group, a company that owned transport fleets, construction equipment, and cargo lines stretching across Ghana and neighboring countries. For years, Felix had been expected to inherit the empire, but something had always troubled him. Too many people treated him differently the moment they learned his name. Conversations changed. Smiles became artificial. Women admired his cars more than his character. So 2 years earlier, after graduating with an engineering degree from London, Felix had made a decision that shocked his family. He would disappear from the wealthy world for a while, live anonymously, work with his hands, observe how people behaved when money was not involved. That decision had led him to Donkor's mechanic yard. And, until recently, the experiment had been simple: observe, learn, stay detached. But Abena Owusu had begun to change that. One afternoon, as Felix was finishing repairs on a car engine, a sleek black SUV slowed near the mechanic yard. The vehicle did not stop. It simply paused for a moment. Inside sat a sharply dressed driver and a middle-aged woman wearing elegant sunglasses. The woman's name was Akosua Badu, a powerful socialite and longtime friend of Felix's family. Her eyes studied the yard carefully. She had been searching for Felix for weeks, and rumors had finally led her here. As the SUV rolled slowly forward again, Akosua spoke quietly. So this is where he hides. The driver glanced nervously at the mechanics covered in grease. Yes, madam. Akosua watched Felix through the window. He was standing beside Abena's cart, laughing softly at something she had said. The sight made her lips tighten, because in her mind, Felix Kankam had a future already arranged. Her daughter, Nana Amabadu, was supposed to marry him, but the young man she saw now did not look like someone thinking about marriage. He looked like someone enjoying the company of a poor girl who had no place anywhere near his world. The SUV continued down the street, but Akosua's mind was already turning. Something about this situation would have to change. Back at the mechanic yard, Abena had no idea anyone had been watching. She was telling Felix about Kwame's dream of becoming a teacher someday. Felix listened quietly. You must be very proud of him, he said. Abena smiled. I am. Then she added softly, he believes life will become easier someday. Felix looked toward the road where the SUV had disappeared. Sometimes, he said thoughtfully, life changes in ways we never expect. Abena laughed. I hope so. Neither of them realized how true those words would soon become, because the quiet friendship forming beside that dusty mechanic yard was already beginning to draw the attention of powerful people. And once the wealthy world turned its eyes toward Abena Owusu, her simple life would never be the same again. The truth about Felix Kankam's life existed in a world so different from Donkor's mechanic yard that it might as well have belonged to another planet. While grease-covered engines lay scattered across the dusty ground in Kumasi, the headquarters of Kankam Logistics Group stood several kilometers away in the heart of the city's financial district. The building was tall, modern, and surrounded by glass walls that reflected the sky like polished mirrors. Inside, air conditioning hummed quietly as executives in tailored suits moved through marble hallways. Large digital screens displayed shipping routes, construction contracts, and fleet movements across West Africa. Every day, millions of CDs passed through the systems of the company, and at the top of it all sat one name, Nana Kankam, Felix's father. He was a man whose reputation had been built on decades of relentless, work-sharp business instincts and an almost legendary discipline. When Nana Kankam entered a room, conversations often stopped. He had started with a single cargo truck more than 30 years earlier. Now his company controlled hundreds. The empire he built had transformed not only his family's fortunes, but entire industries across the region. Naturally, everyone expected his only son to follow the same path, but Felix had never been entirely comfortable with the life prepared for him. From the time he was a teenager, he noticed something strange about the way people treated him. Schoolmates admired him not for his ideas, but for the cars that collected him from the gate. Strangers smiled too easily when they heard his last name, and as he grew older, the attention from certain women began to feel even less genuine. They admired his watches, his houses, his potential inheritance, but rarely did anyone seem curious about the quiet young man behind the wealth. By the time Felix completed his engineering degree in London, the feeling had become unbearable. He wanted to know something simple. What kind of life would people offer him? If they believed he had nothing, that question had led him back to Ghana with a strange plan. Instead of stepping directly into the executive offices, waiting for him, Felix disappeared from his father's business world. He rented a small room in Kumasi. He cut his expensive suits from his wardrobe. And he walked into Yaw Donkor's mechanic yard asking for work. Yaw had laughed when he first saw him. "You don't look like a mechanic," the older man had said. Felix simply shrugged. "I can learn." And learn he did. Within months, he became one of the most capable mechanics in the yard. Not because he needed the money, but because he genuinely loved understanding machines. And more importantly, because the life around him felt real. Customers argued loudly. Workers joked openly. Nobody cared who his father was. It was freedom. At least, until Abena appeared. Meanwhile, inside the polished office tower downtown, Felix's disappearance had not gone unnoticed. In Nana Kankam's private office, a tense conversation unfolded late one afternoon. Across the desk from him sat his younger brother, Felix Kankam, a sharp businessman who handled many of the company's financial operations. Kofi adjusted his glasses and spoke carefully. "The investors are beginning to ask questions." Nana Kankam remained silent. Through the wide window behind him, the city of Kumasi stretched into the distance. "He cannot hide forever," Kofi continued. "This company needs a successor." Nana Kankam finally sighed. "My son is stubborn," he said. "That is one way to describe it," Kofi replied dryly. "Have we confirmed where he is?" Kofi hesitated. "There are rumors he is working in a mechanic yard." For a moment, the office fell silent. "A mechanic yard," Nana repeated slowly. "Yes." Kofi slid a thin file across the desk. Inside were several discreet photographs taken from a distance. One showed Felix standing beside a broken motorcycle. Another showed him crouched beneath a car grease covering his hands. Nana studied the images quietly. Despite the absurdity of the situation, a faint smile appeared on his face. "He always did prefer machines," he murmured. Kofi leaned forward. "You find this amusing?" No, Nana said calmly. "But I understand it." Kofi shook his head. "The shareholders will not understand." Nana closed the file. "Let him finish whatever lesson he believes he is learning. And if the lesson never ends," Nana's voice grew firm, "then I will bring him back myself." Far from the glass towers and business concerns, Felix stood beside Abena in the fading light of another Kumasi evening. The mechanic yard had nearly emptied. Only a few workers remained, finishing their last repairs before closing. Abena leaned against her cart while Felix wiped oil from his hands. "You work too much," Felix said suddenly. Abena laughed. "That is easy to say for someone who fixes engines all day." Felix gestured toward her cart. "You push that thing through half the city, and it feeds my brother." Felix nodded. He had noticed how every conversation eventually returned to Kwame. Everything Abena did seemed to revolve around that boy. "What would you do?" Felix asked thoughtfully if life became easier. Abena tilted her head. Easier. Yes. She considered the question seriously. I think I would like to study nursing, she said. Felix looked surprised. Why nursing? Because hospitals are the places where people feel most alone, Abena replied. And I know what that feels like. Her answer lingered in the quiet air. Felix suddenly realized how rarely anyone in his wealthy circle spoke with such honesty. No ambition for luxury, no talk of status, just a simple desire to help others. It stirred something deep inside him, something dangerously close to admiration. But not everyone saw the situation so gently. 2 days later, the black SUV returned to the street near the mechanic yard. This time it stopped. Akosua Badu stepped out slowly, her elegant heels touching the dusty ground with visible discomfort. The mechanics looked up in confusion. Luxury rarely visited their neighborhood. Akosua's eyes scanned the yard until they landed on Felix. He was kneeling beside Abena's cart again, tightening one of the wheels. The sight made her expression darken. She walked forward. Felix noticed her immediately. For the briefest moment, surprise flickered across his face. "Mrs. Badu," he said quietly. Akosua stopped a few steps away. "So the rumors were true," she said coldly. The other mechanics stared, sensing something unusual in the tension between them. Abena looked from Felix to the elegant woman. "You know her?" she asked softly. Felix hesitated. Akosua answered before he could. "Oh, yes," she said smoothly. "I know him very well." Her gaze returned to Felix. "And I think it is time we talk about why Felix Kankam is pretending to be a poor mechanic." Abena froze. The name meant nothing to her, but the way the words hung in the air made her heart skip. Felix's jaw tightened. "Not here," he said quietly. Akosua smiled thinly. "Then perhaps you should explain to your friend who you really are." Felix glanced toward Abena. For the first time since meeting her, uncertainty crossed his face, because the secret that had once felt harmless was beginning to grow dangerous. And the longer it remained hidden, the more painful the truth would become when it finally emerged. For several seconds after Akosua Badu spoke Felix's full name, the mechanic yard seemed to stop breathing. The sound of metal tools clanging in the background faded into an uneasy silence. A few mechanics looked up from their work, sensing tension but not fully understanding it. Abena stood beside her delivery cart confused. The name, Felix Kankam, meant nothing to her. But the way the elegant woman had spoken, it slowly, deliberately, made the air feel heavy. Felix straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. His calm expression returned, but inside his mind, several thoughts collided at once. Akosua should never have come here. Not like this. Not in front of Abena, Mrs. Badu Felix said quietly. "This is not the place." Akosua crossed her arms. "And why not?" she replied. "Is it because your friends here might learn who you really are?" Felix's jaw tightened. Abena looked between them again. "I don't understand," she said softly. Felix opened his mouth to respond, but Akosua spoke first. "Oh, you will understand soon enough," she said with a faint smile. "But perhaps your mechanic friend should explain." The mechanics in the yard began whispering among themselves. Yadonkor frowned. "Felix," he said cautiously. "What is she talking about?" Felix glanced at the older man. Then he exhaled slowly. "Nothing important," he said. Akosua laughed lightly. "That is not entirely honest." Felix turned toward her again, his voice calm but firm. "Please leave." For a moment it seemed Akosua might refuse. Then she adjusted her sunglasses and gave Felix a knowing look. "This conversation is not finished," she said quietly. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Abena. "And neither is this little experiment of yours." Without another word, she turned and walked back toward the black SUV waiting at the end of the street. The vehicle pulled away moments later, disappearing into the traffic of Kumasi. The mechanic yard slowly returned to life. The other workers shrugged and went back to their engines. Ya Donkor scratched his head. "Strange woman," he muttered. Felix nodded slightly. "Yes," but Abena remained standing exactly where she was, her brow furrowed with uncertainty. "Felix," she said carefully. Who was that? Felix hesitated for a moment. Then he answered simply, "A family friend." Abena studied his face. The answer felt incomplete, but she did not push further. Everyone carried their own complicated stories in Kumasi, and Abena had learned long ago that sometimes people revealed their past only when they were ready. So, she nodded. "All right." Felix felt a quiet wave of relief, but he also knew something had changed. Akosua's appearance meant the world he had left behind was beginning to close in again. That evening, after the mechanic yard closed, Felix walked through the busy streets of Kumasi with heavy thoughts. Market vendors were packing up their stalls. The smell of grilled fish drifted through the warm air. Children played football in dusty alleyways while music from nearby shops blended with the sound of traffic. For most people, the evening carried a sense of routine. But Felix's mind was far from peaceful. He knew exactly why Akosua had come. For years, the Badu family had quietly hoped that Felix would marry Nana Ama Badu, Akosua's ambitious daughter. The arrangement made perfect sense to the wealthy world they lived in. Two powerful families, two strong business connections. But Felix had never shown much interest in Nana Ama. He had met her many times at formal events. She was intelligent, elegant, well-educated. But their conversations always revolved around status, fashion, and social reputation. With Abena, everything felt different. Their conversations were simple, honest, and grounded in real life. And that difference had begun to matter more to Felix than he expected. The next afternoon, Abena returned to the mechanic yard earlier than usual. Kwame had spent the morning coughing heavily, and Abena had left the clinic feeling worried. The medicine bottle the doctor handed her was smaller than before, more expensive. She pushed the cart slowly into the yard. Felix looked up from an engine he was repairing. "You're early today," he said. Abena forced a small smile. "Slow day at the market." Felix noticed the worry in her eyes. "What happened?" Abena hesitated. Then she spoke quietly. "The doctor says Kwame's lungs are weaker again." Felix listened carefully. "He needs stronger medicine," she continued, "and it costs more than before." Felix wiped his hands on a rag. How much? Abena shook her head quickly. "It's all right. I will manage." Felix leaned against the workbench. "Abena." She looked up. "You don't have to handle everything alone." Her expression softened, but she remained firm. "I know," she said gently, "but Kwame is my responsibility." Felix nodded slowly. That answer was exactly what he expected from her, and exactly what made helping her more complicated. Because every time he considered stepping in with the resources he actually possessed, he remembered the reason he had started this entire experiment. If people only cared about him when they knew his wealth, then revealing that wealth too soon would destroy any chance of understanding who truly cared about him. Still watching Abena struggle stirred something deeper inside him, something that made remaining silent increasingly difficult. Later that evening, as the last customers left the mechanic yard, Felix noticed Abena sitting quietly beside her cart again. The sky above Kumasi had turned deep orange as the sun began to set. Felix walked over. "You're not going home yet." Abena shook her head. "I'm waiting for the evening delivery trucks," she explained. "Sometimes the drivers need help unloading goods." Felix sat beside her on the edge of the cart. For a while they simply watched the street. Then Abena spoke softly. "Felix, can I ask you something?" Yes, that woman yesterday, Mrs. Badu. Felix felt a slight tension in his chest. Yes, she called you Felix Kankam. Felix didn't respond immediately. Abena continued carefully. Is that your full name? Felix looked down at his hands. For a moment he considered telling the truth, but he wasn't ready. Not yet. It's just a name she likes to use, he said quietly. Abena studied his face. She sensed again that something remained hidden behind his calm voice. But instead of pressing the question, she simply nodded. All right. The moment passed, but somewhere deep inside Felix's mind a quiet warning began to grow. Secrets had a way of becoming heavier over time, and the longer he allowed Abena to believe he was just a poor mechanic, the more painful the truth might become. Across the city, inside a luxurious restaurant, Nana Ama Badu sat across from her mother. Akosua stirred her drink slowly. I saw him today, she said. Nana Ama's eyes brightened, and Akosua's expression hardened. He was fixing a poor girl's cart. Nana Ama frowned. A girl? Yes. Akosua leaned forward slightly. And if we are not careful, that girl may become a problem. Nana Ama's lips tightened. She had grown up believing Felix Kankam would eventually marry her. Not because of love, but because powerful families arranged powerful futures. Now the thought of a poor market girl interfering with that plan irritated her deeply. Who is she? Nana Ama asked. Akosua smiled faintly. A nobody, but even as she spoke, the word Akosua understood something important. Sometimes, the people who appear to be nobody are the ones capable of changing everything. And if Abena Owusu continued growing closer to Felix, the consequences could reach far beyond a dusty mechanic yard in Kumasi. The accusation came on a market day when Kumasi was louder than usual. The air vibrated with the calls of vendors advertising their goods: fresh tomatoes, smoked fish, plantains stacked in neat golden rows. Women balanced baskets on their heads while taxis pushed through narrow lanes with impatient horns. For Abena Owusu, the day had begun, like many others. She woke before sunrise, helped Kwame swallow his morning medicine, and pushed her delivery cart toward the Kejedia market, where trucks arrived early with goods from surrounding villages. Work was heavy that morning. A rice distributor needed several sacks moved to different stalls. Later, a woman selling bottled drinks asked Abena to carry crates from a delivery van parked 3 streets away. The sun climbed higher. Sweat soaked the back of Abena's faded dress, but she kept moving. Every trip meant a few more cities toward Kwame's medicine. Around midday, Abena arrived at the stall of a trader named Madame Sawa, a sharp-tongued woman known for watching every coin that passed through her hands. Madame Sawa handed Abena a basket filled with packaged spices. Take this to the stall, near the main gate, she said. And be careful. Abena nodded and lifted the basket onto her cart. When she returned 15 minutes later, Madame Sawa's face looked different, suspicious. Where is the money the trader demanded? Abena blinked. What money? The money that was in the basket, Madame Sawa snapped. 200 cedis! Abena felt confusion rush through her chest. There was no money in the basket. Madame Sawa slammed her palm against the table. Don't lie to me! Several nearby vendors turned toward the noise. The market thrived on gossip. Within seconds, a small crowd gathered. She took the money, Madame Sawa continued loudly. I saw it in the basket this morning. Abena shook her head quickly. I swear I didn't take anything. But, in places like the market, poverty often meant suspicion. A young woman with worn clothes was rarely believed over an established trader. Search her cart, someone suggested. Another voice laughed. Of course the poor girl took it. Abena's heart pounded. I didn't steal anything, she repeated. But the whispers around her grew louder. She looks desperate. Maybe she needed medicine. People do anything for money. The words struck Abena like stones, not because they were shouted with anger, but because they were spoken with quiet certainty. Madame Serrois stepped forward and grabbed the edge of Abena's cart. "If the money is not there," she said coldly, "then you will explain where it went." Abena felt tears building behind her eyes. She had spent years protecting her dignity, working honestly, refusing charity. And now, in the middle of the crowded market, strangers looked at her like a thief. Just as Madame Serrois reached toward the cart to search it, a familiar voice cut through the noise. "That won't be necessary." The crowd turned. Felix stood a few steps away. He had arrived earlier to deliver a repaired generator to a nearby shop. Now he walked calmly toward the gathering. Abena stared at him in relief. "Felix." Madame Serrois frowned. "And who are you?" Felix stopped beside Abena. "Someone who knows she wouldn't steal from you." Madame Serrois crossed her arms. "You know that for certain." Felix looked directly at her. "Yes." The trader laughed sharply. "You mechanics think you understand everything. If she didn't take it, where is my money?" Felix glanced briefly at the spice basket still sitting on the table. Then he reached inside. His fingers moved through the packages slowly. A moment later, he pulled out a small folded envelope, hidden beneath the bottom layer. The crowd gasped. Madame Serrois stared. That wasn't there before." Felix opened the envelope. Inside were several banknotes. 200 cedis, he said calmly. The murmurs in the crowd shifted direction. She didn't steal it. It was hidden. Madame Serrois looked embarrassed but unwilling to admit it. "Well, someone must have moved it." Felix placed the envelope back on the table. "Perhaps," he said, but the damage had already been done. The crowd slowly dispersed their attention, moving toward the next piece of gossip. Abena remained standing beside the cart, her hands trembling. Felix turned toward her. "Are you all right?" Abena nodded weakly. "Yes." But the moment the last bystander disappeared, the strength she had been holding together collapsed. Her shoulders began to shake. Felix stepped closer. "Abena." Before he could finish, she covered her face with her hands. "I didn't take it," she whispered. "I know," Felix said softly. "It's just—" Her voice broke. "People always think the worst when you are poor." Felix didn't immediately answer, because deep down he knew she was right. He had watched it happen many times since he began living anonymously. People judged quickly, especially when money or the lack of it was involved. Abena wiped her eyes and tried to steady herself. "I'm sorry you had to see that." Felix shook his head. "You did nothing wrong." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The market sounds continued around them, but the noise seemed distant. Then Abena said quietly, "Sometimes I feel like no matter how hard I work, it will never be enough." Felix felt something tighten in his chest. He had spent years surrounded by wealth. But in this moment, he understood something deeper about struggle than any business meeting had ever taught him. He gently placed a hand on the cart handle beside her. "You're stronger than you think," he said. Abena gave a faint, tired smile. "Strength doesn't always pay for medicine." Felix looked down. That sentence stayed with him long after they left the market. Later that evening, after the mechanic yard closed, Abena remained sitting beside her cart again. The sky above Kumasi was darkening. Felix sat beside her. "You didn't have to defend me today," she said quietly. Felix shrugged. It was the truth. Abena stared at the street ahead. "When everyone was accusing me, for a moment I thought maybe you would believe them too." Felix turned toward her. "Never." The certainty in his voice surprised even him. Abena looked at him carefully. Why? Felix considered the question. Finally, he answered simply, "Because I've watched how you live." Abena lowered her eyes. For the first time since the accusation in the market, a feeling of calm returned. Someone believed her, not because of proof, but because of trust. And that trust meant more than the 200 seed eyes ever could. Across the city, in a brightly lit apartment overlooking Kumasi, Nana Amabadu scrolled through photographs on her phone. One image caught her attention. Felix, standing beside Abena in the market earlier that day. Someone had taken it from a distance. Nana Ama's expression hardened. "So that's the girl," she murmured. Her mother Akosua glanced at the screen. "Yes." Nana Ama studied the photo carefully. Abena looked ordinary, poor, unimportant, and yet Felix stood beside her like someone who cared. That alone made her dangerous. Nana Ama placed the phone down slowly. "If she is the reason Felix continues this foolish game," she said calmly, "then perhaps it's time someone reminded her where she belongs." Akosua didn't respond, but she didn't disagree either, because sometimes the quietest threats grow in the shadows, long before the people they target realize danger is coming. And Abena Owusu had just stepped into a conflict far bigger than she could imagine. In the days following the incident at the market, life in Kumasi continued with its usual rhythm. But beneath the surface, quiet tensions were beginning to grow. Abena returned to her routine of long mornings, pushing the delivery cart through crowded streets, stopping occasionally at Yaw Dongkor's mechanic yard whenever the wheels needed tightening. Felix continued working beside engines and motorcycles as though nothing had changed. Yet both of them felt the invisible shift. Something fragile had formed between them after the accusation at the market. Trust. Not the shallow kind that came from polite conversation, but the deeper kind built when someone stood beside you while the world doubted you. For Abena, that moment had meant more than she could easily explain. For Felix, it had meant something even more dangerous. Because the longer he stayed near her, the harder it became to keep his secret life hidden. One late afternoon, the mechanic yard buzzed with unusual activity. A taxi driver had brought in an engine with a serious overheating problem, and several mechanics gathered around it, arguing loudly about the cause. Felix crouched beside the open hood, listening quietly while the others debated. Finally, he spoke. "The water pump is failing," he said calmly. Yaw Dongkor looked skeptical. "You're sure?" Felix nodded. "Check the belt." A few minutes later, the problem was confirmed. Yaw slapped Felix on the shoulder with a laugh. "You always see what the rest of us miss." Felix smiled faintly, but said nothing. Across the yard, Abena had just arrived with her cart. She watched the exchange with amusement. "You're becoming the most important mechanic here," she teased when Felix walked over. Felix wiped his hands with a rag. "I just listened to the engines." Abena leaned against the cart. "I wish people were that easy to understand." Felix raised an eyebrow. "People are more complicated. Much more." Her words carried more meaning than Felix realized. That evening, Felix returned to his small rented room near the outskirts of the city. The room was modest. A narrow bed, a wooden chair, a small desk with a lamp. For most mechanics in Kumasi, the space would have seemed ordinary. But for the heir to one of Ghana's largest business empires, it represented a strange kind of freedom. He removed his work shirt and washed the grease from his hands. Then his phone buzzed on the table. The screen displayed a name he hadn't spoken to in weeks: Uncle Kofi. Felix sighed before answering. "Hello." Kofi Kankam's voice carried the calm authority of a man used to being listened to. "Felix, we need to talk." Felix sat down. "I'm listening. You've been gone long enough." Felix rubbed his forehead. "I told Father I needed time, and he gave you that time," Kofi replied. "But investors are asking questions. The board expects you to return soon." Felix remained silent. Kofi continued. "There are contracts waiting for your signature. Expansion plans. Negotiations with partners in Nigeria and Côte d'Ivoire. I understand. Then you also understand that pretending to be a mechanic cannot continue forever. Felix looked at the cracked paint on the wall across from him. The room suddenly felt smaller. I'll come back soon, he said quietly, when Felix hesitated. Soon, Kofi exhaled sharply. You're not telling me everything. Felix didn't respond. After a pause, Kofi asked a different question. Is there someone? Felix frowned. What do you mean? I mean a reason you're still there. Felix's thoughts immediately drifted toward Abena. Her tired smile. The way she pushed the cart through the market. The way she refused help unless she earned it. But he said none of that. No, he replied. Kofi didn't sound convinced. Well, his uncle said finally, whatever you're doing, finish it quickly. The company cannot wait forever. The call ended. Felix sat quietly in the dim room. For the first time since starting his experiment, the weight of two separate worlds pressed heavily against each other. Meanwhile, Abena was walking home with Kwame beside her. The boy held her hand as they moved through the narrow street leading to their building. Did you work a lot today? Kwame asked. Abena nodded. Yes. Kwame looked up at her. You're tired. Abena smiled softly. That's part of the job. They reached their small room. Inside, Abena prepared a simple dinner of rice and beans. Kwame ate slowly, but seemed cheerful. Then he said something unexpected. Abena. Do you like the mechanic? Abena nearly dropped the spoon. What? Kwame grinned mischievously. Felix. Abena tried to sound calm. He's just a friend. Kwame studied her face carefully. You smile more when you talk about him. Abena laughed nervously. You're imagining things. But later that night, as Kwame slept beside the small window, Abena lay awake staring at the ceiling. She thought about the moment Felix defended her in the market, about the quiet way he listened whenever she spoke, about the strange feeling of peace she experienced when he was near. It scared her, because feelings like that often led to disappointment, and Abena had learned to protect her heart carefully. Across the city, Nana Amabadu sat in a stylish cafe with two of her friends. They were discussing weekend events and upcoming social gatherings when Nana Ama casually placed her phone on the table. The photograph of Felix and Abena at the market remained on the screen. One of her friends leaned forward. Who is she? A market girl, Nana Ama replied coolly. Her friend frowned, and Felix Kankam is spending time with her. Nana Ama's smile was thin. For now. The second friend laughed. That won't last. Nana Ama sipped her drink slowly. No, she said calmly. It won't. But inside her mind, a plan was already beginning to form. Felix's strange experiment had gone on long enough, and if the poor girl named Abena was the reason he refused to return to his real life, then removing her from the picture would be necessary. The next morning, Abena arrived at the mechanic yard earlier than usual. Felix was already there working alone before the others arrived. You're early, he said. So are you, Abena replied. They stood facing each other for a moment in the quiet yard. Then Felix said something that surprised them both. Would you like to walk with me after work tonight? Abena blinked. A walk, Felix nodded. Yes. Abena hesitated. Life had taught her to be cautious, but something about Felix made her feel safe. All right, she said softly. Felix smiled. Neither of them realized that this simple walk would mark the moment their lives began moving toward something much deeper and far more complicated. Because once emotions entered the fragile balance between truth and deception, the consequences would be impossible to control. That evening, Kumasi softened under the golden light of sunset. The mechanic yard had closed early after a long day of work. One by one, the other mechanics drifted away. their laughter fading down the dusty street as they headed home. Felix finished wiping down his tools and glanced toward the gate. Abena was waiting beside her cart, just as she had promised. The warm air carried the scent of grilled corn from a nearby roadside stall. Traffic hummed faintly in the distance, but here on this quiet side street, the city felt calmer. Felix walked over. "Ready?" he asked. Abena nodded. "Yes." She pushed the cart toward the side of the building and locked one of the wheels with a small metal chain she carried. It wasn't much security, but theft in this neighborhood was rare when everyone knew each other. Felix gestured down the road. "There's a small park near the river," he said. "We can walk there." Abena smiled slightly. "I didn't know mechanics liked parks." Felix chuckled. "Mechanics like quiet places, too." They began walking side by side. For the first few minutes, neither of them spoke much. The road curved gently, past small shops closing for the evening. Vendors packed away their goods while children chased each other through the fading sunlight. Eventually, Abena broke the silence. "You never told me why you chose to work at the mechanic yard," she said. Felix looked ahead at the road. "I like working with my hands," he replied. "That's not the whole answer." Felix glanced at her. "You're very observant." Abena shrugged. "When you grow up having to read people carefully, you notice things." Felix slowed his steps slightly. "And what have you noticed about me?" Abena thought for a moment. "You're not like the other mechanics," she said. Felix raised an eyebrow. "In what way?" "You listen more than you talk," she replied. "And when you fix something, you're very patient, like you're solving a puzzle." Felix smiled faintly. "That's not a bad description." Abena continued walking, but her voice softened. "And sometimes, it feels like you're hiding something." Felix's heart skipped once. He kept his expression calm. "Everyone hides something," he said. Abena nodded slowly. "Yes." Her answer carried a quiet understanding that surprised him. She wasn't accusing him. She was simply acknowledging a truth about human nature. They reached the small park near the river, just as the sky deepened into shades of purple and orange. The place was simple, a few wooden benches, tall trees, and a narrow path that followed the water's edge. A couple sat quietly near the far side, watching the reflection of the sunset on the river. Felix and Abena sat on an empty bench. For a moment, they both looked out across the water. The city noise felt distant here, peaceful. Abena folded her hands in her lap. "I used to come to places like this with my parents," she said softly. Felix turned toward her. "Before the accident," Abena nodded. "My father liked quiet places." She paused. "He said people think better when they can hear themselves think." Felix watched the gentle movement of the river. "Your father sounds wise." "He was," Abena said. Her eyes drifted downward. "I miss him every day." Felix didn't try to offer comforting words. Sometimes silence was the most respectful response to grief. After a while, Abena spoke again. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever feel like your life should be bigger than what it is now?" Felix blinked slightly. "That's an unusual question." Abena smiled faintly. "I think about it sometimes." She looked toward the river. "When my parents died, everything became smaller. My dreams, my plans, even my future." Felix listened carefully, but part of me still believes something better might exist. She continued, "Even if I can't see it yet." Felix felt a quiet stir inside his chest. For years he had lived surrounded by luxury that most people would consider the definition of better. Yet sitting beside Abena in this small park felt more real than most of those experiences. "What would your life look like if those dreams came true?" he asked. Abena laughed softly. "I already told you. I would study nursing." Felix nodded. and after that I would work in a hospital. She hesitated. And maybe help people who don't have anyone to care for them. Felix smiled. That sounds like a meaningful life. Abena glanced at him curiously. What about you? Felix looked toward the river again. He had been asked that question many times by business mentors and investors. But never like this. I'm still trying to understand what kind of life I want, he said honestly. Abena studied him for a moment. You're searching for something, she said. Felix didn't answer, because she was right. A light breeze moved through the trees. The evening grew cooler. For a while they simply sat together in comfortable silence. Then Abena spoke again. Felix, can I tell you something honestly? Yes. At first I thought you were strange. Felix laughed. Only at first Abena smiled. You don't act like most men I meet. How do most men act? They talk a lot, she said, and they usually want something. Felix raised an eyebrow. And I don't. Abena hesitated. That's the strange part, she admitted. Felix looked at her carefully. And what if I did want something? Abena met his gaze. What Felix felt the moment hanging between them. The words forming in his mind were dangerous, but they came anyway. Maybe I just want to spend time with you. Abena's expression softened. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet park seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Abena said gently, That's the first honest thing you've said tonight. Felix laughed quietly. I've been honest all evening. Not entirely, she replied. Felix looked at her curiously. And what do you think I'm hiding? Abena shook her head. I don't know. Then she added softly, But whatever it is, I hope it's not something that will hurt me later. The words landed heavily in Felix's chest, because the truth he was hiding had exactly that potential. Across the city, Nana Amabadu sat in her apartment balcony, looking down at the bright lights of Kumasi. Her phone rested on the table beside her. On the screen was another photograph, Felix and Abena walking through the park together earlier that evening. Someone had followed them. Nana Ama's lips curved into a cold smile. So it's becoming serious, she murmured. Behind her, Akosua stepped onto the balcony. You're certain? Her mother asked. Nana Ama turned the phone toward her. Akosua studied the image carefully. Then she sighed. Your father will not like this. Nana Ama's voice remained calm. Neither will Felix's family. She leaned back in her chair. But don't worry. Akosua raised an eyebrow. What are you planning? Nana Ama's smile widened slightly. Just reminding a poor girl that some worlds are not meant to mix. Back at the park, Felix and Abena stood up from the bench. The sky had turned dark and streetlights flickered on along the road. They walked back toward the mechanic yard slowly. At the corner where their paths separated, they stopped. Thank you for the walk, Abena said. Felix nodded. I enjoyed it. Abena smiled. So did I. For a brief moment, they stood quietly under the streetlight. Then Abena turned and began walking toward home. Felix watched until she disappeared down the narrow street. Inside his chest, a realization settled heavily. His experiment had changed. What had started as curiosity was slowly becoming something deeper, something far more dangerous than he intended. Because once emotions were involved, truth could no longer remain hidden forever. The morning after their walk by the river, Kumasi woke beneath a gray sky that promised rain. Clouds gathered low over the city, and the usual brightness of the market streets felt slightly dimmed. Abena pushed her delivery cart carefully through the damp roads, her thoughts drifting back to the conversation she had shared with Felix the night before. Something had changed between them. It wasn't dramatic or obvious, but the quiet understanding they shared now felt deeper than before. Still, Abena reminded herself not to read too much into it. Life had taught her that hope could be dangerous when circumstances were uncertain. She focused instead on work. 3 deliveries before midday, 2 more in the afternoon. If she worked quickly enough, she might earn enough to buy Kwame's medicine for the next few days. Across town, inside an elegant boutique cafe, Nana Amabadu sat at a small table near the window. She wore a cream-colored dress and gold earrings that shimmered whenever she moved her head. 2 friends sat across from her chatting casually, but Nana Ama's attention remained fixed on her phone. A message had just arrived from the private investigator she had hired the previous day. The message contained only 2 words: "Found her." Below it was an address. Nana Ama smiled slowly. "So that's where she lives," she murmured. Her friend looked up. "Who a girl?" "Felix has been spending time with." Her friend raised an eyebrow. "Is she beautiful?" Nana Ama laughed softly. "Not particularly." "Then why would Felix care?" Nana Ama tapped the phone thoughtfully. "Sometimes men like the idea of rescuing someone." She stood up. "I think it's time we had a conversation." Later that afternoon, Abena arrived at the small clinic where Kwame's medicine was usually collected. The building was crowded. Parents waited with restless children, and nurses moved quickly between the narrow hallways. Abena stood in line at the pharmacy window. When her turn came, the pharmacist handed her a small bottle. 45 cedis, he said. Abena counted the money carefully from her pocket. She had just enough. Relief washed through her chest. She thanked the pharmacist and stepped outside. But before she could begin walking home, a voice behind her spoke. "Abena Owusu." Abena turned. Standing beside a sleek black car was a young woman dressed in elegant clothes that seemed out of place in the modest neighborhood. The woman's posture carried confidence. Authority. "I'm sorry," Abena said politely. "Do we know each other?" The woman smiled faintly. "My name is Nana Amabadu." Abena shook her head. "I don't think we've met." "No," Nana Ama replied smoothly. "But we have someone in common." Abena's stomach tightened slightly. "Who, Felix?" For a moment, Abena felt a strange mix of surprise and curiosity. "You know, Felix." Nana Ama's smile widened. "Oh yes," she said. "I know him very well." Abena didn't know why, but something about the woman's tone made her uneasy. "What can I help you with?" Abena asked cautiously. Nana Ama stepped closer. "I wanted to talk somewhere private." Abena hesitated. The street around them bustled with people, but suddenly it felt as if the world had narrowed to the 2 of them. "There's nothing to discuss," Abena said. Nana Ama tilted her head slightly. "Are you sure?" She opened her handbag and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a thick stack of money. Abena stared. "What is that?" "A gift," Nana Ama said calmly. Abena frowned. "For what?" "For leaving Felix alone." The words hung in the air like a sudden thunderclap. Abena's chest tightened. "I don't understand." Nana Ama's expression remained composed. "Felix belongs to a different world than yours," she explained. "The sooner you accept that, the easier things will be." Abena shook her head slowly. "I'm not asking Felix for anything." Nana Ama smiled politely. "That may be true." She extended the envelope. "But temptation can appear unexpectedly." Abena looked at the money, then back at Nana Ama. "I don't want it." Nana Ama's eyes hardened slightly. "You should think carefully." "I have." Abena stepped back. "I don't need your money." A few people nearby glanced toward them, sensing tension. Nana Ama lowered the envelope slowly. "You're very proud," she said. Abena didn't respond. The silence between them grew colder. Finally, Nana Ama spoke again. "You believe Felix is just a mechanic, don't you?" Abena blinked. "Yes." Nana Ama let out a quiet laugh. "How charming." Abena felt a strange chill run through her body. What do you mean? Nana Ama leaned closer. You really don't know who Felix Kankam is. The name echoed in Abena's mind. She remembered Akosua Badu using it days earlier. Felix had brushed it off. He's a mechanic, Abena said firmly. Nana Ama studied her face carefully. For a moment, genuine surprise flickered in her eyes. You're serious? Abena's heartbeat quickened. What are you talking about? Nana Ama closed her handbag slowly. Then she smiled again. A man like Felix doesn't spend his life fixing broken motorcycles, she said. Abena felt confusion rising inside her chest. What kind of man is he? Then Nana Ama didn't answer directly. Instead, she stepped back toward her car. Perhaps one day you'll find out. She paused before opening the door. But when that day comes, her voice softened, though the words carried a sharp edge. I hope you remember that I offered you a very generous opportunity. With that, Nana Ama entered the car. The engine started. Moments later, the vehicle disappeared down the street. Abena stood frozen outside the clinic. The bottle of medicine felt heavy in her hand. Felix Kankam. The name echoed again in her mind. Something about Nana Ama's confidence disturbed her deeply. But Abena forced the thought aside. Felix had never given her any reason to doubt him. He worked in the mechanic yard every day. He repaired engines. He lived like everyone else in their neighborhood. Nana Ama was probably just a rich woman trying to create trouble. Still, as Abena began walking home, a quiet unease followed her. That evening, when she arrived at the mechanic yard, Felix noticed the change immediately. You look troubled, he said. Abena hesitated. Then she spoke. I met someone today. Felix wiped his hands slowly. Who Nana Ama Badu? Felix's heart skipped. What did she want? Abena studied his face carefully. She offered me money to stay away from you. Felix's jaw tightened. Abena continued quietly, and she said something else. Felix already knew what was coming. She said, your name is Felix Kankam. The mechanic yard seemed unusually silent. Felix didn't answer immediately. Abena took a slow breath. Felix. Her voice carried a mixture of confusion and trust. Is there something about you I don't know? Felix looked into her eyes. And for the first time since meeting her, he realized the truth might soon be impossible to hide. For a long moment after Abena asked the question, the mechanic yard felt unusually quiet. The evening light filtered through the open metal roof, casting long shadows across the dusty ground. Somewhere in the distance, a taxi horn blared, followed by the fading rumble of traffic moving through Kumasi's crowded streets. Felix stood beside the workbench, a wrench still in his hand. Abena waited. Is there something about you I don't know? Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't accusing. It was simply searching for honesty. Felix lowered the wrench slowly and placed it on the table. There were 100 ways he could answer her question. He could dismiss Nana Ama's words as a misunderstanding. He could pretend the name meant nothing. He could even reveal the truth completely. But each option carried consequences he wasn't ready to face. So he chose the safest answer. People like Nana Ama enjoy creating stories, he said carefully. Abena watched his face. That doesn't answer my question. Felix felt the pressure of her gaze. She grew up in a wealthy family, he explained. Sometimes people like that assume everyone around them must also belong to their world. Abena frowned slightly. So the name means nothing. Felix forced a small shrug. It's just a name. Abena studied him for a few seconds longer. Part of her wanted to push further, but another part, the part that had learned patience through years of hardship, told her to stop. Trust took time, and forcing it rarely helped. All right, she said quietly. Felix felt a brief wave of relief, but deep inside, the unease remained. because the truth had come closer to the surface than ever before. Over the next few days, something subtle shifted between them. Not enough to break their connection, but enough to change its balance. Abena continued visiting the mechanic yard as usual. They still talked, still laughed occasionally. But Felix sensed a new awareness in her eyes, as if she had begun examining the details she once ignored. One afternoon, as Felix finished repairing a motorcycle, Abena noticed something unusual. A sleek black car had stopped briefly at the end of the street. The driver stepped out and approached Felix quietly. They spoke for less than a minute. Then the driver handed Felix a sealed envelope before returning to the car. The vehicle drove away immediately. Abena watched from across the yard. When Felix returned to his workbench, she raised an eyebrow. "Do mechanics usually receive envelopes from men in luxury cars?" Felix paused. "It was just a delivery." Abena crossed her arms. "For you, yes." "What kind of delivery?" Felix hesitated. "Parts order confirmation." Abena tilted her head slightly. "Do parts usually arrive in sealed envelopes?" Felix smiled faintly. "You're becoming very suspicious." Abena laughed softly. "Maybe I'm just paying attention." Felix nodded slowly. "Yes, maybe you are." That evening, rain finally arrived over Kumasi. Heavy drops began falling just as the mechanic yard closed. Felix and Abena stood beneath the metal roof, watching the downpour turn the street into a river of muddy water. "You'll have trouble pushing the cart in this," Felix said. Abena shrugged. "I've managed worse." Felix considered something. "Wait here." He disappeared briefly into the storage room and returned with an old raincoat. "Take this," he said. Abena blinked. "You'll get soaked." Felix smiled. "I live close." Abena hesitated before accepting it. "Thank you." They stood together for a few minutes longer as the rain continued. Finally, Abena spoke. "Felix, can I ask you another question?" "Of course, if you had a chance to live a completely different life. Would you take it?" Felix looked at the rain falling beyond the roof. "A different life from what? From the one you're living now." Felix thought carefully. "I suppose it depends on what the new life offered." Abena nodded slowly. "And what if it offered wealth?" Felix turned toward her. "That sounds like Nana Ama again." Abena smiled faintly. "Maybe." Felix leaned against the wall. "Wealth solves some problems," he said, "but it also creates others." Abena looked surprised. "That's not how most people describe it." Felix shrugged. "Most people have never experienced both sides." Abena stared at him. "What do you mean by that?" Felix realized too late that his words had revealed more than he intended. "Just something I've noticed," he said quickly. Abena didn't respond, but the curiosity in her eyes deepened. Across the city, Nana Amabadu sat in her office, reviewing a folder of documents. Inside were photographs, notes, addresses, every piece of information her investigator had gathered about Abena Owusu. Her small rented room, her younger brother, her work in the market. Nana Ama closed the folder slowly. "So she really is just a poor girl," she murmured. Akosu Abadu entered the room moments later. "Well," Nana Ama leaned back in her chair. "She refused the money." Akosua frowned. "That makes things more complicated." "Yes," Nana Ama agreed calmly. "But not impossible." She tapped the folder thoughtfully. "Felix thinks he's conducting some romantic experiment." Akosua folded her arms. "And you intend to end it?" Nana Ama's smile returned. "I intend to show that girl the truth about his world." Back in the mechanic yard, the rain had finally slowed to a gentle drizzle. Abena prepared to leave. Felix walked her to the gate. As she stepped into the street, she turned back. "Felix." "Yes, that woman. Nana Ama." Felix's expression tightened slightly. "What about her?" Abena met his eyes. "She believes you belong to a much bigger life." Felix didn't answer. Abena continued softly. I don't know if she's right or wrong. Felix remained still. But if she is right, her voice carried a quiet honesty. I hope you'll tell me yourself someday. Felix watched her carefully, and if I do, Abena smiled gently. Then I'll decide what it means. With that, she turned and walked into the rainy street. Felix stood at the gate long after she disappeared. For the first time since he began hiding his identity, the future of his secret no longer depended only on him. Because Abena was beginning to see the cracks in the story he had created. And once those cracks widened, the truth would eventually break through. The truth arrived on an afternoon that neither Felix nor Abena had planned. Kumasi was bright under a clear sky, and the mechanic yard was unusually busy. Several taxis had broken down after a long weekend of heavy use, and Ya Dongkor was shouting instructions as engines lay open across the dusty ground. Felix was crouched beside a small delivery truck, tightening a loose belt, when Abena appeared at the gate. He noticed her immediately. She waved lightly. Busy day. Felix wiped his hands on a rag. Very. Abena leaned against her cart, watching the mechanics work. After weeks of visiting the yard, the place had begun to feel strangely familiar to her. The sounds, the smell of oil, the rhythm of tools striking metal. And Felix, moving calmly through the chaos like someone who understood every piece of it. But today, she hadn't come for repairs. I was going to the clinic for Kwame's appointment, she said. I thought maybe we could walk part of the way together. Felix nodded. Give me 10 minutes. Abena waited near the entrance while Felix finished the repair. What she didn't notice at first was the sleek black SUV slowly approaching from the opposite end of the street. The vehicle stopped directly in front of the mechanic yard. 2 men in dark suits stepped out first. Then a third man emerged. He was older, tall, and carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Every mechanic in the yard turned toward the unfamiliar visitors. Ya Dongkor frowned. Can I help you? He asked. The older man didn't respond immediately. Instead, his eyes scanned the yard until they landed on Felix. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the man walked forward. Felix. The single word cut through the noise like a blade. Felix froze. Abena noticed the change instantly. The man standing before them was Kankam, Felix's father. He looked exactly as he did in business magazines and news interviews across Ghana, impeccably dressed, composed, and impossible to ignore. But Abena had never seen those magazines. To her, he was simply a powerful stranger, walking into a mechanic yard. Felix slowly stood up. Father! The mechanics nearby stopped working completely. Ya Dongkor blinked. Father Kankam stepped closer, his eyes moving briefly over Felix's grease-stained clothes. You've had your time, he said calmly. Now we need to talk. Felix glanced toward Abena. Her confusion was already visible. Not here, Felix said quietly. Kankam followed his gaze. For the first time he noticed Abena standing beside the cart. His sharp eyes studied her carefully. Who is she? Felix hesitated. Someone important to me. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Abena's heart skipped. Kankam raised an eyebrow. That complicates things. The mechanics exchanged puzzled glances. Ya Dongkor scratched his head. What exactly is going on here? Kankam turned toward him politely. My apologies for the interruption, he said. Then he gestured toward Felix. You've been employing my son. The sentence dropped into the yard like a stone. Ya Dongkor laughed awkwardly. I think you're mistaken. Kankam's expression remained calm. No. He reached into his jacket and handed Felix a folded newspaper. The front page displayed a business headline. Kankam Logistics expands West African shipping network. Below the headline was a photograph. Felix, dressed in a suit, standing beside his father at a corporate event. Abena stared at the image. Her breath caught in her throat. The mechanic she had known for months suddenly appeared in a completely different world. The realization moved slowly through her mind. Felix Kankam, the name Nana Ama had mentioned, the envelope, the luxury car driver. Every strange detail she had noticed suddenly fit together. Felix was not a poor mechanic. He was the heir to one of Ghana's largest business empires. Her chest tightened. Felix looked at her. Abena. But the words felt painfully insufficient. She shook her head slowly. "You lied to me." "I didn't lie," Felix said quickly. You let me believe something that wasn't true." The yard remained silent. Even the distant traffic seemed to fade. Felix stepped closer. "I wanted to understand people without money involved." Abena stared at him. "People." His explanation sounded worse the moment he said it. "I mean, you were studying us." Her voice was no longer soft. It carried the sharp edge of betrayal. "No," Felix insisted. "It wasn't like that." Abena laughed once. A short, broken sound. "All this time, I thought we were friends." Felix's chest tightened. "We are." "No." Abena stepped back. "You were watching me." Felix shook his head. "That's not true." But Abena's mind replayed every moment they had shared. Every conversation, every kindness. Now each one felt different, like pieces of an experiment she hadn't agreed to be part of. "Did you enjoy it?" she asked quietly. Felix frowned. "Enjoy what pretending to be poor?" The words struck harder than he expected. "I wasn't pretending," he said. "I really worked there." Abena gestured toward the yard. "Because you wanted to." Felix didn't answer. She was right. For him, it had been a choice. For her, poverty had never been optional. Nana Kankam watched the exchange silently. He had seen business negotiations collapse before. But this was different. This was personal. "Felix," he said gently, "we should continue this discussion somewhere else." Felix barely heard him. His eyes remained on Abena. "I was going to tell you," he said, when Felix hesitated. "I don't know." Abena nodded slowly. "Exactly." The realization settled inside her like cold water. Felix Kankam had entered her life pretending to be something he wasn't, and even if his reasons sounded noble, the deception still hurt. "I need to go," she said quietly. Felix reached toward her. "Abena, please." But she stepped away. "Don't." The word carried more pain than anger. Abena grabbed the handle of her cart. Then she began pushing it down the street. Felix stood frozen. For the first time since revealing his identity, he understood the real cost of his experiment, because the one person whose opinion mattered most now looked at him like a stranger. As Abena disappeared around the corner, Nana Kankam stepped beside his son. "You should have told her earlier," he said calmly. Felix stared down the empty street. "I know." The older man studied him carefully. "You care about her." Felix didn't deny it. "Yes." Nana Kankam sighed. "Then you've made this far more complicated than it needed to be." Felix looked toward the road where Abena had gone. The space between them now felt enormous, because some truths, once revealed, could never be undone. For several days after the truth was revealed, Abena Owusu avoided the mechanic yard completely. She took different streets through the market, different delivery routes. Even when her cart began making the familiar creaking sound that meant a bolt needed tightening, she ignored it. The thought of returning to the place where everything had changed felt too painful. At night, when Kumasi grew quiet and Kwame slept beside the window, Abena lay awake staring at the ceiling. Her mind replayed every moment she had shared with Felix. The first time he repaired her cart, the way he defended her in the market, their walk by the river, the quiet honesty in his voice when he spoke about life. Now each memory carried a second meaning. Had he been studying her, testing her, watching how a poor girl behaved under pressure? The questions hurt more than the answers. Because somewhere deep inside, Abena still believed the kindness Felix had shown her was real. And that belief made the betrayal even harder to process. Felix, meanwhile, stood at the mechanic yard every day hoping she might appear. But she never did. The empty space near the gate where her cart usually stood felt strangely noticeable. Ya Donkor eventually noticed Felix's distraction. "You've been staring at that street all week," the older man said one afternoon. Felix wiped his hands slowly. "I'm just thinking." Ya crossed his arms. About the girl. Felix didn't answer. Ya sighed. "You should go talk to her." Felix shook his head. "She doesn't want to see me." Ya nodded thoughtfully. "That may be true." He leaned against the workbench. "But sometimes people don't need distance." Felix glanced at him. "What do they need?" Honesty, Ya replied. Felix looked down at his hands. That was exactly the problem. He had been honest about many things with Abena, just not the one truth that mattered most. Across the city, Abena sat beside Kwame in the small clinic waiting room again. The boy was flipping through a worn storybook while she watched the rain falling outside the window. Abena Kwame said suddenly, "Yes, why don't we see Felix anymore?" Abena's chest tightened. She forced a calm tone. "He's busy." Kwame frowned slightly, but he always had time before. Abena didn't know how to answer. Children often saw emotional truths adults tried to hide. "He lives a different life than we do," she said quietly. Kwame tilted his head. "What do you mean?" Abena looked toward the gray sky outside. "It means some people belong to worlds we can't enter." Kwame thought about that. Then he asked something unexpected. "Did he hurt you?" Abena blinked. "No," she said softly. But the word felt incomplete. Felix hadn't intended to hurt her. Yet the pain still existed. Later that afternoon, as Abena walked home through the market, she noticed a familiar voice calling her name. "Abena." She turned. Standing near a fruit stall was Adjoa Mensima, one of the women she occasionally worked for. Adjoa waved excitedly. "Come here." Abena approached. "What's wrong?" Adjoa held up a newspaper. "Isn't this the mechanic you used to talk about?" Abena's stomach tightened. She looked at the front page. There was Felix again, dressed in a dark suit, standing beside his father at the opening of a new shipping terminal in Tema. The headline read, "Felix Kankam returns to family business after 2-year absence." Adjoa laughed. "You never told me your mechanic friend was a millionaire." Abena forced a small smile. "I didn't know." Adjoa studied the photo again. "He's handsome too." Abena didn't respond. Instead, she handed the newspaper back and continued walking, but the image stayed in her mind. Felix looked comfortable in that world, confident, important, like someone who belonged there completely. The realization hurt more than she expected, because it confirmed something she had been trying not to admit. Felix had never truly belonged in her world. That evening, Felix stood inside the large office building of Kankam Logistics for the first time in months. The polished marble floors reflected the lights above, and employees moved through the hallways with quiet efficiency. Several executives greeted him warmly. "Welcome back, Mr. Kankam. It's good to see you again." Felix nodded politely, but said little. His father walked beside him toward the executive office. "You've been away long enough," Nana Kankam said calmly. Felix didn't argue. He understood the responsibilities waiting here. Contracts, meetings, decisions that affected thousands of workers across the region. But as he stepped into the office overlooking the city, his thoughts drifted elsewhere. To a small room near the market, to a girl pushing a delivery cart through crowded streets, The following morning, Nana Amabadu visited the office. She entered confidently dressed in a tailored white suit. Felix barely looked up from the documents on his desk. "I heard you returned," she said. Felix nodded. "Yes." Nana Ama studied him carefully. "You look unhappy." Felix closed the folder in front of him. "What do you want?" She smiled. "Only to congratulate you." Felix's expression remained neutral. "Thank you." Nana Ama leaned against the desk. "You see," she said softly, "everything is back where it belongs." Felix understood exactly what she meant. He said nothing. Nana Ama continued. "That girl from the market." Felix's voice cut through her sentence. "Leave her out of this." Nana Ama raised an eyebrow. "So you still care?" Felix stood up slowly. "That's none of your business." Nana Ama's smile remained calm. "Perhaps." She walked toward the door. "But eventually you'll understand something important." Felix waited. "People from our world," she said, "don't build their lives around market girls." The door closed behind her. Felix stood alone in the office. The city stretched beyond the windows, filled with opportunity and power. Yet the victory Nana Ama described felt strangely hollow, because wealth and status could solve many problems, but they couldn't repair trust once it had been broken. That evening, Abena pushed her cart slowly through the quiet streets after finishing work. The sky above Kumasi was clear again. Stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky. She stopped briefly at the river park where she and Felix had sat together only weeks earlier. The bench was empty. Abena stood there for a moment. Then she whispered quietly to herself, "I hope you find the life you were searching for." With that, she turned and continued walking home, unaware that far across the city, Felix Kankam was staring out of his office window thinking the exact same thing about her. 2 weeks passed after Felix returned to the headquarters of Kankam Logistics Group. From the outside, his life appeared to have resumed its natural course. Board meetings filled his mornings. Business negotiations consumed his afternoons. Reports, contracts, and financial projections piled across the polished desk in his office, overlooking Kumasi's busy skyline. Executives praised his sharp decisions. Investors expressed renewed confidence in the company's future. To everyone around him, Felix Kankam looked exactly like the heir the business world expected. But privately, something remained unsettled. Often during quiet moments between meetings, Felix found his mind drifting back to the mechanic yard. The smell of engine oil, Ya Dongkor's loud laughter, the dusty streets where Abena pushed her cart each morning. He wondered how she was doing, whether Kwame's health had improved, whether she had forgiven him or if she even wanted to. Felix had considered visiting her many times. Yet every time the idea surfaced, the memory of her expression, the day the truth came out, stopped him. The disappointment in her eyes had been far worse than anger, because disappointment suggested something deeper. Trust broken, and trust, Felix understood, now could not simply be repaired with apologies. Meanwhile, life had not become easier for Abena. Without realizing it, Felix's quiet presence had once provided a small sense of safety in her daily routine. Now that absence left her feeling strangely alone. She continued working long hours in the market, pushing her cart through crowded streets under the intense Ghanaian sun. But the cart itself had begun showing signs of wear again. The wheels squeaked constantly. One of the handles had loosened. Ordinarily, she would have taken it straight to the mechanic yard. But pride and pain kept her away. Instead, she attempted to fix it herself using an old wrench borrowed from a vendor. The repair held for a while, but not for long. One afternoon, while transporting a heavy crate of cooking oil, the weakened handle snapped completely. The cart tipped sideways, sending the crate crashing onto the road. Several bottles shattered. The shop owner shouted angrily, "You've ruined my delivery!" Abena apologized repeatedly. and helped clean the mess, but the damage had already been done. The owner deducted the cost of the broken bottles from her payment. By the time Abena left the market that evening, she had earned almost nothing. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders. Still, she pushed the damaged cart slowly toward home. That same evening, Felix attended a formal dinner organized by business partners visiting from Nigeria. The restaurant was elegant, filled with soft lighting and quiet music. Executives discussed investment opportunities, while waiters moved gracefully between tables, carrying trays of food. Felix sat beside his father, listening politely as conversations shifted between logistics contracts and future expansion. But his attention wandered. Across the room, Nana Amabadu laughed with a group of guests. She seemed perfectly comfortable in the environment, confident, charming, exactly the kind of woman many people expected Felix to marry. At one point, Nana Ama approached their table. "You've been very quiet tonight," she said. Felix gave a polite smile. "Just listening." She leaned slightly closer. "You're still thinking about her, aren't you?" Felix didn't respond. Nana Ama's voice softened. "You should let it go." Felix looked at her calmly. "Why?" "Because it's unrealistic," she said simply. Felix's expression hardened slightly. "You think poor people aren't allowed to be important?" Nana Ama shook her head. "That's not what I said." "Then what did you say?" She gestured around the luxurious restaurant. "This is your world." Felix glanced at the polished tables, the expensive wine, the quiet conversations about international business deals. But instead of pride, he felt a strange emptiness. "My world," he said slowly, "should include the people who matter to me." Nana Ama sighed. "Felix, you're confusing emotion with reality. Maybe." But inside, Felix already knew something important. Reality had become far more complicated than he expected. Later that night, heavy rain began falling over Kumasi again. The storm arrived, suddenly sending people rushing for shelter. Abena had just reached the narrow street near her home when the rain intensified. The broken cart handle made pushing difficult, and the muddy road slowed her progress even more. She struggled forward step by step. Halfway down the street, the weakened wheel finally collapsed. The cart tipped again. This time the entire frame twisted sideways. Abena grabbed the handle, trying desperately to hold it together. But the damage was too severe. The cart, the tool that supported her daily work, was finished. Rain soaked her hair and clothes as she stood staring at the broken wood and metal. For a moment she felt completely defeated. Without the cart, earning money would become almost impossible. Kwame's medicine, rent, food, everything suddenly felt uncertain again. Abena closed her eyes, taking a slow breath. She had faced hardship before. She would face it again. But the exhaustion of doing it alone weighed heavily on her heart. Across the city, Felix stood at the large window of his apartment, watching the storm move across Kumasi. Lightning flashed briefly over the skyline. Something restless stirred in his mind. Without fully understanding why, he grabbed his car keys. Within minutes, he was driving through the rain-soaked streets. He didn't have a destination planned, only a feeling. A quiet instinct pulling him back toward the part of the city he had once called home. Toward the mechanic yard, toward the market, toward Abena. Meanwhile, Nana Amabadu sat comfortably inside her apartment, sipping tea as the rain fell outside. Her phone buzzed. A message from the investigator appeared on the screen. "Update. The girl's cart broke tonight. She may lose her work." Nana Ama smiled slowly. "Interesting," she murmured. Her mother Akosua looked up from a magazine. "What is it?" Nana Ama set the phone down. "Sometimes life solves problems for us." Akosua raised an eyebrow. "You mean the girl?" Nana Ama nodded. "Yes." She leaned back in her chair. "If she can no longer support herself, Felix will see what we already know." Akosua studied her daughter carefully. And what exactly is that? Nana Ama's voice remained calm. That the worlds they come from were never meant to mix. Back in the rain-filled street, Abena finally managed to drag the broken cart to the side of the road. Her arms trembled from exhaustion. Water dripped from her clothes as she leaned against the wall of a small shop. For the first time in many months, she felt uncertain about what tomorrow would bring. But somewhere far down the road, a pair of headlights was already moving toward her. And within minutes, Felix Kankam would see exactly how fragile Abena's life had become, without the support she once refused to accept. The moment approaching would force both of them to confront a difficult truth. Love built on deception could break trust, but abandoning someone in their moment of greatest struggle could break something even deeper. The rain had not slowed when Felix's car turned into the narrow street near Abena's home. Water flowed along the edges of the road, carrying bits of trash and leaves toward the drainage ditch. Most of the streetlights flickered dimly through the storm, casting uneven reflections across the wet ground. Felix drove slowly. He wasn't entirely sure what had pulled him back to this part of the city. The instinct had arrived suddenly, strong and impossible to ignore. As he turned the final corner, his headlights illuminated a familiar figure, standing beside a wall. Abena. She was soaked from head to toe, her hair clinging to her face as she struggled to lift the twisted frame of her broken cart. Felix's chest tightened. He pulled the car to the side of the road and stepped out into the rain. Abena. She looked up sharply. For a moment, surprise flashed across her face. Then something colder replaced it. Felix! The rain drummed against the metal roof of the car behind him. Felix walked closer. What happened? Abena gestured toward the cart. It finally broke. Felix crouched beside the damaged wheel, examining it quickly. The frame had bent. The axle had snapped. The cart was beyond simple repair. Felix exhaled slowly. You can't use this anymore. Abena nodded. I figured that out. Her voice carried quiet exhaustion. Felix stood. Let me help. Abena shook her head immediately. No. Felix frowned. Why not? Because I don't want charity. Felix's expression softened. This isn't charity. Yes, it is. Abena stepped back. You're a rich man now, remember. The word struck harder than she intended. Felix paused. The rain continued falling heavily around them. I never stopped being the same person you met, he said quietly. Abena let out a small, bitter laugh. You stopped the moment I learned who you really were. Felix felt the truth of that statement settle painfully in his chest. I should have told you earlier, he admitted. Yes, I thought if people didn't know my name, they would treat me differently. Abena looked directly at him. And did they? Felix nodded. Yes. And what did you learn? Felix hesitated. Some people are kinder than I expected. Abena's voice softened slightly, and others Felix didn't answer. Instead, he said something else. I also learned that honesty matters more than I realized. The rain slowed, slightly turning from a heavy downpour into a steady drizzle. Abena wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. Felix noticed immediately. Come inside the car, he said. No, you're freezing. I'll be fine. Felix sighed. Abena, please. For a moment she considered refusing again, but the exhaustion in her body made standing in the rain unbearable. Reluctantly, she stepped toward the car and sat inside. Felix closed the door behind her before walking around to the driver's side. The interior of the car was warm and quiet. Abena stared straight ahead at the windshield where raindrops slid slowly downward. Felix started the engine. Where were you going? He asked. Home. I'll drive you. Abena hesitated. Then she nodded. They drove through the narrow streets in silence. Felix followed Abena's directions until they reached the small building where she lived. The rain had nearly stopped by the time they parked. Felix turned off the engine. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Abena didn't look at him. "Sorry for hurting you." She finally turned toward him. "You didn't just hurt me." Felix waited. "You made me question whether anything between us was real." Felix met her gaze. It was real. Abena studied his face carefully. "How do I know that?" Felix thought for a moment. Then he spoke honestly. "Because losing your trust hurt more than any mistake I've made in business." Abena remained silent. The vulnerability in his voice surprised her. Felix continued. "I never meant to treat you like part of an experiment." "But you did." "Yes." The admission came without hesitation, and I regret it. Abena exhaled slowly. "Regret doesn't change what happened." "I know." Felix glanced toward the broken cart still visible in the headlights outside. "But maybe it can change what happens next." Abena followed his gaze. "That cart is my work," she said quietly. "I know." Felix turned back to her. "And I want to help fix that problem." Abena shook her head again. "I told you. This time it's not about money." She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Felix leaned forward. "My company owns several logistics warehouses across the city." Abena listened cautiously. "We always need reliable workers to help manage inventory deliveries." Abena stared at him. "You're offering me a job." Felix nodded. "A real one, with a salary." "Yes." Abena looked uncertain. "That sounds like charity with a uniform." Felix shook his head. "No." He spoke carefully. "I'm offering work because I know you're responsible, honest, and hard-working." Abena thought about the long days she spent pushing the cart through crowded markets, the constant worry about rent. Kwame's medicine. A stable job could change everything, but pride still tugged at her heart. "Why me?" she asked. Felix answered simply. "Because you deserve better opportunities than what life has given you." The sincerity in his voice made it difficult to argue. Abena looked down at her hands. "You're trying to fix everything." Felix shook his head. "No." He spoke quietly. "I'm trying to make things right." Inside the apartment upstairs, Kwame sat near the window, waiting. When he saw Abena step out of the car with Felix behind her, his face lit up with excitement. "Felix." The boy ran toward the door as they entered. "I thought you disappeared forever." Felix laughed softly and knelt to hug him. "Not forever." Kwame looked between them curiously. "Are you two friends again?" Abena and Felix exchanged a glance. Neither answered immediately. Finally, Abena said softly, "We're talking." Kwame nodded happily. "That's good." Children often accepted emotional complexity with simple optimism. Felix stood and looked toward Abena again. "Think about the job," he said. Abena nodded slowly. "I will." Felix walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back once more. "Abena." "Yes, I meant what I said earlier. About everything between us being real." Abena didn't respond immediately, but something in her expression had softened slightly. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the possibility of it. Felix stepped outside into the cool night air. As he walked back toward the car, he realized something important. Wealth had allowed him to solve many problems throughout his life. But earning back Abena's trust would require something far more difficult: patience, honesty, and time. Upstairs, Abena stood by the window watching Felix's car disappear down the street. Kwame tugged her sleeve. "Do you think he'll come back?" Abena looked out into the quiet night. "Yes," she said softly. "I think he will." But the real question wasn't whether Felix would return. It was whether their relationship, damaged by secrets and misunderstanding, could survive the truth that had finally come into the open. And the answer to that question would soon arrive. The following morning, Kumasi woke beneath a clear sky. The rain from the previous night had washed the streets clean, leaving the air fresh and cool as the city slowly returned to life. Abena stood near the small window of her room, watching the early sunlight spread across the narrow street below. Kwame sat on the bed, finishing his breakfast, humming quietly while flipping through his storybook. But Abena's mind remained elsewhere. Felix's words from the night before echoed softly in her thoughts. A real job, a chance to fix things. For the first time in a long while, the future no longer looked like an endless road of pushing a broken cart through crowded markets. Still, accepting Felix's help felt complicated. Not because she doubted his sincerity, but because she feared losing something far more important than pride: independence. She had built her life through years of effort and sacrifice. Letting someone else change that path, even someone she once trusted, was not a decision she could make lightly. Kwame suddenly looked up. "You're thinking about Felix again," he said. Abena blinked. "Am I that obvious?" Kwame grinned. "Yes," Abena laughed softly. "You're supposed to be reading." "I am reading," Kwame said, "but I can still notice things." He closed the book. "Are you angry at him?" Abena considered the question carefully. "No," she said slowly. "Then why do you look sad?" Abena sat beside him on the bed. "Because sometimes people can hurt you even when they don't mean to." Kwame thought about that. "Do you think he's sorry?" Abena remembered the way Felix looked the previous night standing in the rain beside the broken cart. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think he is." Kwame smiled. "Then maybe you should forgive him." Children, Abena realized, often saw life with a clarity adults complicated with pride and fear. Later that afternoon, Abena arrived at the large warehouse Felix had mentioned. The building stood near the industrial district of Kumasi, surrounded by delivery trucks and stacks of shipping containers. Workers moved in and out carrying packages, while forklifts hummed across the concrete floor. Abena felt slightly out of place walking toward the entrance, but before she could hesitate further, Felix appeared from inside the building. He was dressed differently today, not in the expensive suits she had seen in newspapers, but in simple work clothes similar to what warehouse supervisors wore. He smiled when he saw her. "You came." Abena nodded. "I said I would think about it." Felix gestured toward the building. "Let me show you around." They walked through the large warehouse together. Rows of inventory shelves stretched across the floor. Workers scanned packages while supervisors checked delivery lists on tablets. "This is where incoming goods are sorted before distribution across the city," Felix explained. Abena listened carefully. "And what would I do here?" Felix pointed toward a small office near the loading area. "The inventory manager needs someone reliable to track incoming shipments and coordinate delivery schedules." Abena raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like a lot of responsibility." Felix smiled. "You handled half the market's deliveries with a wooden cart." Abena couldn't help smiling slightly at that. Felix continued. "The job includes training and a salary." "Yes." Abena looked around the warehouse again. This kind of opportunity could change everything for her and Kwame. But she still needed to say one more thing. "Felix." "Yes. If I accept this job, it won't be because I feel sorry for you." Felix nodded. "I understand, and it won't be because you feel guilty." Felix's expression softened. "That's not why I offered it." Abena studied his face. "Then why?" Felix answered simply. "Because I believe in you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Abena nodded slowly. "All right." Felix blinked. "All right, I'll take the job." Relief spread across his face. "Good," but Abena raised a finger. "One condition." Felix chuckled. "I expected that. No special treatment." "Of course, I want to earn my place here the same way everyone else does." Felix nodded again. "Deal." They shook hands. But the gesture carried something deeper than a business agreement. It marked the beginning of a new chapter between them. Over the following weeks, Abena quickly proved herself at the warehouse. Her experience managing deliveries in the market made learning the logistics system easier than expected. She organized schedules efficiently, tracked inventory with careful attention, and earned the respect of the other workers through quiet determination. Kwame's health improved as well. Regular medicine became easier to afford. For the first time since their parents died, Abena felt stability entering their lives. Meanwhile, Felix made a quiet decision of his own. Instead of returning fully to the corporate executive role expected of him, he began splitting his time between the office and the operational side of the company, working closer to the warehouses, closer to the people whose daily labor kept the business running. His father noticed the change. "You're leading the company differently than I did," Nana Kankam said during one meeting. Felix smiled slightly. "Maybe the company needs that." His father studied him for a moment, then nodded approvingly. One evening, several months later, Felix found Abena standing outside the warehouse after work. The sun was setting behind the industrial buildings, painting the sky orange and gold. "You've done well here," Felix said. Abena smiled. "I had a good teacher." Felix shook his head. "You taught yourself." They stood quietly, watching the trucks leave for their evening routes. Finally, Felix spoke again. "Abena, there's something I've been wanting to ask you." She turned toward him. "What is it?" Felix took a slow breath. "When we first met, I was hiding who I really was." Abena nodded. "I remember, but now you know everything." "Yes." Felix met her eyes. "So, this time, if I ask you to spend time with me again." He hesitated briefly. "It will be as the real Felix." Abena studied him carefully. The same calm sincerity she had seen months earlier still lived in his voice. But this time there were no secrets behind it. She smiled softly. "I think I'd like that." Felix returned the smile. And in that quiet moment, the long journey from deception to honesty finally found its beginning of healing. Life often teaches its most powerful lessons in unexpected ways. Felix believed that hiding his wealth would help him understand people better. In some ways, he was right. Disguising himself as a poor mechanic showed him kindness, humility, and the quiet strength of everyday people who struggle to survive. But he also learned something far more important. Love and trust cannot grow where truth is hidden. Even when deception begins with good intentions, it can still wound the people we care about most. Abena's story reminds us that dignity does not come from money, status, or power. It comes from character. The quiet courage to keep moving forward even when life feels unfair. She did not fall in love with wealth. She cared for the man she believed Felix truly was, and when the truth hurt her, she chose self-respect over easy comfort. Felix's journey, on the other hand, shows that real change requires humility. Apologies alone are not enough. Trust must be rebuilt through patience, honesty, and actions that prove growth. In the end, neither wealth nor poverty defined their future. What mattered most was the willingness to face truth, learn from mistakes, and treat one another with respect. Because the greatest riches in life are not measured in money. They are measured in the people who believe in us when we have nothing and in the courage we show when it's time to make things right. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from and what time is it in your country right now? Stories like this remind us that kindness and honesty still matter in the world. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Thank you for watching.